Hello and welcome to my comments on your Google Hangout for the group by Justin, Nahrya, and Valerian, Trey. With Justin facilitating, I just wanted to let you know that you had a really good group discussion. I particularly enjoyed the fact that you didn't skip the risk communications during the Ebola crisis. Not every group covered that topic, so I was really glad to see you engaged in that. And you started with it. So you started with question number 5. So let me go over some of the things that you talked about that I thought that were really, really good. So Trey, you specifically discussed Duncan case in Dallas County, and you talked about intelligence gathering or tracking. And the fact you brought out the fact that Liberia certainly was on the list of the most affected areas by the World Health Organization as far as the Ebola outbreak. So the fact that Duncan traveled to that country could have been a warning or red flag for the analysis and for the proper assessment of his case when he first presented at that hospital. Certainly, with our ability to track movements, through air, even though we are in globalized society, we still could have surveillance tracking, and surveillance tracking is one of the most successful methods of containing an outbreak. So with only one case in the United States, the response to it was less than exemplary. So, that sort of puts it in perspective for us. What would it be if we actually did have an outbreak happen in the United States? How it would have been, the information would have been managed. So the breakdowns and protocols that occurred as far as information sharing or what information was actionable. Trey, I think that you talked about the fact that the surveillance of those diseases are no longer a matter of just, crisis management by health departments in the United States as a regular epidemic outbreak. We have to look at it from the Homeland Security perspective and a terrorist nexus, because certainly some of those outbreaks could be leveraged by terrorist organizations. So as far as risk assessment, or, what the clinics or hospitals being part of the critical infrastructure of the United States need to look for is really important in that information sharing. Nahrya talked about the fact that the risk communication did not address very well the risk analysis, and the way CDC communicated risk was not very actionable for the public. I think we discussed in the semester, things like a Homeland Security advisory system and what it means for people when you say, if you see something, say something. And I think if you were to parallel those this particular case with how CDC manage the dissemination of the information to the public, it wasn't done. It wasn't managed very well. So both in respect to intelligence, as you're looking at the terrorism nexus, as well as the processes of information sharing with the public, you can take that Lowenthal cycle and break it down in the same components. And here, certainly, there's surveillance analysis that Nahrya mentioned, and then also dissemination, or that one before last step of the intelligence cycle. You can see very well where the failures and breakdowns happened. And also, I like Nahrya's take on the media and how media covers the details of the failures. And Justin jumped in, and you had that discussion on, how much of the information that is out there is truly actionable and vetted and triangulated and reliable. And in risk communications, this is particularly very important. And yet, as we discussed this semester, media tend to take what they get off and run with it. So it does not go through the vetting process. So you get the lead and it's out there, and then of course you can retract it later and it's on the page 7 in a small print, right? But the public already has been informed about something that has not gone through the entire intelligence process. Obviously, with those fast-moving events, that intelligence cycle is not going to last for weeks. It's going to be shorter, but that doesn't mean that those elements, even in a shorter framework, should not still be there. And one of those elements being proper analysis. And if you're talking about analysis, you have to look at triangulation of sources and research and confirmation and eliminating bias and looking at historical cases and so on and so forth. And then when you get to the dissemination, it seems like what the media does, they take the product that's in no way confirmed, verified, vetted, and the entire analysis part gets skipped and dissemination happens, and then the public acts on information that is that it's not really good for how you communicate, specifically in the cases of high uncertainty, where people need reassurance and need good, actionable message, what they're supposed to do, what the protective actions are supposed to do. So I think, Justin, you nailed it here. So the messaging, of course, was based on improper information. And again, you talked about how globalization makes it very hard to pinpoint the points, what I call the points of entry, of a threat, of a hazard. But it's certainly not impossible with that many different agencies and tracking and surveillance. World Health Organization gets on those health outbreaks from the get-go, and they are very good about tracking and increasing the levels of preparedness and levels of, what kind of information needs to be released at what level and who might be affected and how it progresses worldwide. So we did not do that as well from domestically. I think that I wanted to tell you something about my personal friend who flew during the Ebola outbreak, flew from Nigeria to the United States via London. And Tony Onwebuzi, who is another professor at our college. And Tony was in Nigeria right at the time of the outbreak. And when he flew back to his flat in London, he was in London for a day and was flying back out of London to the United States. And he was really shocked when he arrived in London. There was no screening, there was no questions asked, or nobody was monitored. And he was playing out that scenario of, if he was infected in Nigeria, it would be very hard to track him because he would have just simply gotten on a plane out of London, flying to the United States, which he did, without ever mentioning that he was, in fact, traveling earlier to a different country. So in that respect, excuse me, it's my sorry, too many devices. So certainly there is this risk of globalization, that not everything can be tracked, because that requires a really, really robust system of anticipating where somebody's prior movements could have been before they even got on a plane, a few days later. And you certainly make those points. Nahrya talked about vaccinations as precautionary measures, and the possibility of a person flying being a walking threat. And certainly, Duncan was a walking threat, and he sort of fell through the cracks. But you also brought up, and I think Justin brought up the issue of a nurse that came back from either Liberia or Nigeria in her case. And her case was a little bit different. her case was the one where she was not symptomatic and she was able to monitor her symptoms at home, yet she was told that she could not leave the house. And it raised the issue of mandatory quarantine from the part of local law enforcement, who are not very well prepared or versed in how to enforce something like that. So there is a possible breakdown of protocol from the standpoint of, what kind of laws are we going to implement during the big outbreaks, and what kind of preparation do we have for actually enforce them. And in her case, yes, they looked at the precautionary principle, but in her case, actually, she had an expertise to know exactly what to do and how to look at her own symptoms, which she didn't have. So there's two different things happening during the Ebola crisis. One is a lack of really good knowledge about public knowledge about Ebola and its potential consequences. The other one is, the overabundance of caution that triggered some of the issues of civil liberties. And I think that's what Justin was referring to. And of course, you discussed all the fact that, we only had that one case, and yet we had 2 nurses that got infected, one of them getting on a plane. So now you're looking at surveillance of the entire plane, and certainly those contacts were made and people had to be quarantined from that plane, and that plane had to be cleaned. And that was just because the information about the temperature levels or range of temperature for Ebola was different than initially reported by CDC. So they released this information too quickly without really assessing it better for the public. Question number 4 had to do with Corexit and the use of the precautionary principle in conditions of high uncertainty, specifically with marine spills and marine ecology. And you had a discussion on that. Justin, you did a very good overview of what precautionary principle was. And also you talked about the decision to use Corexit was extremely risky. When you consider, and you mentioned those, you consider the mechanical removal, which is skimming, or the second one up would be the burning of it, which, it's a little bit has to do with the environment as well, with the toxicity and different components getting released into the air. But again, it's less invasive than the dispersants. And the dispersant is considered, like in European countries, particularly in those ecological zones like Baltic Sea, they are considered the sort of strategy of the last resort. Some of the countries do not use Corexit at all. UK being one of them. So it's very interesting that BP operating outside of the UK in the United States resorted to such massive use of a dispersant with very little definitive research on its consequences when mixed with oil, because I think, you also have an issue of very good knowledge of what Corexit is. So Nahrya agreed that, given the exposure of first responders, it was very risky. I have to bring to your attention the fact that traditional first responders were not the only first responders in Deepwater Horizon. In fact, if you read through the reports, the BP decided to help out the boat operators that were losing, economically, they were losing revenue. And again, 5 years after Katrina, that whole region is whammed again by another disaster of such a high scope. So BP started writing checks for the so-called vessels of opportunity to where fishermen who operated boats were encouraged to come and help with the response effort. But certainly none of those volunteers were educated properly on hazards of that particular environment in which they were to work, particularly with respect to personal protective equipment. There were some cases of, for example, Vietnamese-speaking boat operators that were put through a very quick hazardous training, which talks about the hazardous substances and protection from them. But of course, there were Vietnamese speakers, and it's very debatable how much information they got out of it. And certainly, all those volunteers wanted to get the money from BP because they needed income. When you're thinking about the 3 months of this spill in the Gulf, that is tremendous economic effect, as you saw in this case. So it was high risk not only for traditional first responders, but perhaps will have a little bit more experience with that type of emergency response, but also those volunteer responders that were merged into the emergency operations that had very little mitigating or protective processes that were applied with respect to them. You talked about, not much happening, after X and Valdez. We had some initial research that indicated that dispersants might be deleterious to our health. And then, that research and subsequent research was not heeded. Now, granted, research on Corexit was non-conclusive in this particular scenario. But when you use precautionary principle, then that uncertainty was very, very high to go from the top shelf solution, the most risky and the most dangerous solution in the approach to collection and oil spill management. Of course, you discussed, Trey, you talked about EPA being on the board of NALCO, and certainly that doesn't help when the Environmental Protection Agency does not know exactly the composition of the material that's being used because of intellectual property issues. Naturally, the British BP worried about losses, economical losses, which was staggering for the company. I mean, they were tied up in lawsuits for years to come. They spent a tremendous amount of money, and this whole public image of the big oily slick on the surface of the ocean did not look very good to them from the public relations standpoint. So, they sort of went for the most drastic measure with Corexit dispersant in unprecedented amounts. Certainly, it was an unprecedented incident. Instead of, relying on those a little bit more aggressive ways of eliminating the waste. Justin, I think that you mentioned that the company approved it Corexit every day, and there was no monitoring and decision making. I mean, once a decision was made about Corexit, they were dumping gallons of it and claiming that the oil was being dispersed, where in reality, the research shows that it might be Corexit itself might be like soap, which was the argument that the company was using, or not any more dangerous than your ivory soap. But when it's mixed with a certain compounds, it was 50 times more toxic than if the oil was allowed to stay on the surface. Naturally, the issue of it staying on the surface was really bad for BP politically, and of course, the CEO of BP was eventually fired, Hayward, because of inability to, because of his strong focus on mitigating the optics of the event instead of, involving the community and decision makers in a better approach to this. Of course, you talked about food safety issues and environmental concerns and the impact of using Corexit in the Gulf on the fishing industry, on the seafood industry, as Nahrya and Justin, like the and I think Trey as well, like the seafood, you're very concerned about the ecosystem and appropriate measures, safety measures put in place. So we're not solving one problem here, while we are creating a chain reaction that's not visible, that might not have consequences, might not be immediately visible, because with those type of chemicals, of course, there are longitudinal effects that you cannot just see the direct impact immediately. And so Nahrya again talked about the lack of safe or conclusive research about Corexit. So if there is not enough research, where do we go with those events? Do we err on the side of caution, again, with a precautionary principle, or do we take high risk, based on other priorities, and, specifically when we have a private-public relationship that we are dealing with? And you did talk about the mechanical collection would have been a preferred issue. Of course, it was a tremendous spill. Mechanical collection would have been very laborious and required a lot more money spent to hire, of course, a lot more people to do it effectively. And again, it was a very complex incident, but I think you made a really good point that even when the decision to use Corexit was made, that decision was never revised. And it's just basically that strategy was from then on a predominating strategy, with some of those volunteers working in that environment without proper protective equipment. Justin talked about, lack of, Justin and Trey both talked about, the byproduct of very risky, innovative explorations. When you are undertaking routine exploration, it might be a little bit different with your precautionary principle based on the history. But when you have no history and you're looking at something that's unprecedented, that Macondo oil, that platform, it went to the depths that, the exploration had never happened before at those depths. So again, ecologically, there is nothing, or if any, research on potential effects, and we went with the highest risk in exploration and the highest possible risk in response to that particular event. So I thought you had the good discussion on social responsibility and looking at the environmental impacts before we look at profits. Of course, this is this big discussion on intelligence and information dissemination and analysis and research when it relates to the public sector, right? Because we're talking about public-private partnerships. That goes both for national security as well as information sharing, how those interactions are between the for-profit companies, intellectual property, patents, the rights to certain information that maybe it's not released versus, the public good, and certainly social responsibility for the planet. I think you all mentioned that. So the question number 3 that you addressed had to do with the trust of communities once, the effects of proper communications and dissemination of proper information to communities, specifically first responders here. And Trey, I think, underscored the fact that BP minimized the potential impacts and consequences of a disaster that had, huge potential consequences to health. Underestimated the amount of leak material. There was information was inaccurate, considering, such a big company not being able to assess risk properly and then communicate that risk properly to the public and to the communities. And certainly, with that community that those communities that 5 years earlier had Katrina, And some of those businesses and industries were certainly affected by the hurricane and barely out of a recovery process, if at all out of a recovery process from that event for a lot of those areas, with very strongly hurt trust to public institutions, and now they're going through this again. So that certainly ruins the image. I think you discussed from the video, the town hall meetings and the lack of integration of communities in decision making, and I think it's really important that certainly we want people that have expertise in science. And here, the topic of oil exploration is very complex and requires, really strong scientific foundation. And BP sort of really dismissed the community knowledge. Because BP certainly does not operate at the local grassroots community level. So it is really important in those events to look at the whole community concept as far as information sharing. And certainly providing good estimates of how much oil was leaking is really, really critical for those governors, for their policy making, and for their activation of different emergency management processes. And again, you discussed the different the way that the message was managed, or how people were not allowed to issue public statements and public warnings. And Nahrya, I think a very, very important point you made is that the community was not invited to share the community knowledge. Obviously, those communities know best what drives their economy, what kind of protective measures they can take, what kind of capacities and capabilities they have and what they don't have, what kind of protective actions they expect the government to take, particularly as they were invited. I mentioned those vessels of opportunity that integrated all spontaneous volunteers from the region, and they were paid money, and yet the risk was not properly communicated to them. It's very, very critical that those communities are being taken into account. They have a lot of knowledge about the region. They have a knowledge about the environment. They might not have the research-based knowledge, but they have experience, with the decades of working in that environment, and certainly their voices have not been heard. In that question, I wanted to see a little bit more discussion on specifically, I don't think you discussed that, maybe you did later on. No, you didn't discuss this. I asked you about the interoperability and issues of safety of first responders. And what I was particularly interested in was you illuminating a little bit more on the fact that in Deepwater Horizon, when the event happened, what went into effect was a national contingency plan. National contingency plan is very old. It was designed in the late 60s after Exxon Valdez and early 70s. And National Contingency Plan has never been aligned with National Response Framework. If you recall from your emergency management and homeland security courses, the National Response Framework is a model to manage critical incidents domestically, and there is a whole set of processes that get triggered by National Response Framework. And if you recall, based on National Response Framework, it's the jurisdiction of the event rests at the lowest level. So particularly the governors of the state are responsible for managing of that event in their state. And then it sort of goes up to the federal level. So from the local all the way to federal. National Contingency Plan is a little bit different. The way it organizes, it's more of it's a very, very strong focus on a federal coordination. The problem is that those two frameworks are not crosswalked, which means that they have not been aligned to where one is merit to another. They exist in separation. So if you're talking about a critical incident, in Mississippi or in Florida or in Alabama or in Louisiana is going to be different on land versus if you have an oil spill. There's a totally different framework, even though we have an all hazards approach, right? So this was a huge issue specifically because under National Response Framework, there is this Stafford Act that goes into effect that dictates federal aid to affected jurisdictions. And also there is a function of a safety officer, an incident command system, as you studied that, or maybe you will study about different functions of management of domestic incidents. Safety officer is this function that is responsible for the safety of first responders. And that function is supposed to eliminate, reduce, or mitigate risk related to exposure by the first responders. Because Deepwater Horizon was run under the National Contingency Plan, the role of safety officer was never activated, and also there were issues with the Stafford Act. So ultimately, the responders or the volunteers did not have mechanisms that would protect their participating in a response, if that makes sense. So even though there was unified command, even though there were incident command posts and joint information centers and all those things like you expect in National Incident Management System, because there was a disconnect, who does what and who is responsible, because of this National Response Framework on one hand, which all the governors and emergency state emergency operations centers directors were very well versed in. And on the other hand, you have this totally different plan with different players as far as oil spills. And this is where the response was problematic, particularly with respect of protecting the safety of first responders and linked to the decision of the most risky use of the way of putting out that spill, which was that dispersion of the corexit. So this is very important to know that, we can have the best intentions on information sharing, but if we have totally different frameworks out of which we play, then there is a confusion and there is breakdowns in communication, particularly breakdowns in responsibility and accountability and financing, who is paying for it, and that took place in Deepwater Horizon. So then your conversation moved into the question whether the private sector should be an equal decision maker with the public sector, I think that you mentioned, Nahrya, talked about BP having the issue of systemic failures and a history of lack of safety processes as far as that company, and that brings us to looking at the Ministry of the Mineral Service, that was sort of the legislator for the oil exploration. That's the licensing body that issues permits and licenses, and yet that Mineral Services did not have expertise or good research capability to sort of measure the compliance with those processes. So if this is missing, if accountability on the part of public government is missing on those companies, should those companies have an equal part in decision making? And I think, you were discussing that. Justin, I think, was talking about an issue, again, the same issue about the government having more oversight, but the government cannot have oversight if the government does not have expertise. And that certainly was the case. The EPA deferred on a lot of those decisions to BP because did not have experts, knowledgeable enough. And of course, with private sector, you have intellectual property issues. You discussed those in the case of the Apple and San Bernardino FBI investigations debacle. It's very, very similar case here, that Nalco Industries that do the Corexit, they have a proprietary information on that compound, and EPA did not have a specifics how exactly that substance is, what's composed of, other than some company assessment of its lack of harmful impact on the environment. So again, to what degree private and public should make decisions equally? I think, you discussed the fact it depends. It depends on their history of safety, and BP certainly did not have good cultural history of safety operations. It depends on how good the public government is with their capabilities and knowledge. And certainly, public government did not have a very vast knowledge in mitigating the spill. And certainly, they did not have expertise in how to stop it to start with, or how to measure risk. So it's going to be an issue determining how the unified command is working if you have those gaps. Nahrya again was talking about trying to use the unified command, and certainly unified command doesn't mean that everybody's authorized to make the same decisions, because it's going to depend on what the knowledge base is. I think that the big issue here with the public-private thing is that certainly there are different priorities for the public sector, which is going to be more focused on that social responsibility and environmental impact, versus private that is really every minute costs money. Every minute that BP is out of operations in that region on that particular rig, in that particular area, they are losing millions of dollars. So, it's a question of their survival, certain decisions and certain priorities that they're setting. And that certainly was the case of their CEO, Hayward. Certain decisions that he made about, lack of transparency, lack of proper dissemination of information to the public, and the whole PR campaign by BP was very, very much grounded in economics. In the optics of how it looked, and in the perception, and in the money being lost every day by BP. So I enjoyed your discussion overall. I think that something to remember in all of that is why do we talk about that? We talked a lot about secrecy and intelligence cycle and clandestine operations, and the human and SIGINT and all those different ends of intelligence. And on the other hand, we have open source information, and in a lot of those cases, just simply managing open source and communicating and information sharing is equally important in our intelligence and information management. And the breakdowns can happen as easily in the area where all the information is out there, where the research is accessible, where those different frameworks, they are there. Somebody needs to look at them and compare them and analyze them and synchronize them. So intelligence and information, both for Homeland Security and national security, have to go through the same processes of, again, exploitation and analysis and proper dissemination and proper feedback. Because, again, when you don't have that community feedback, then, you're moving into the next cycle of collecting information or doing research without incorporating the lessons learned. And that's certainly very obvious in a lot of cases with emergency management. We repeat the same mistakes over and over again because in our intelligence assessment, we have not integrated that feedback on the very, very far end of the event. And so the question to ponder is, would we deal with a type of spill differently now that in 2010? And I think the jury is out on that. We certainly have a lot more research on Corexit, but that compound is still in use in the United States. There was a bill to ban Corexit that was proposed out of Texas. And it had a lot of traction and a lot of support and a lot of advocacy in the months following the spill. And then sort of, it died on arrival and really never got ratified. So, we have those issues of complacency and a lack of political will and policy maker sort of outliving its term and moving on to other things, and the different priorities take place. So we still live with Corexit, at least in the United States. So the fun part of the Google Hangout 4 at the end was you had to determine who is the best at deception. And so let's take a look at collectively at your group. I think, let's see, Nahrya. Talking about Nahrya wasn't a very good liar. I think you called her out on shoes specifically. It was very interesting that you were in a Thanksgiving parade. That was I didn't know that. That's kind of cool. Since we just celebrated Thanksgiving, must have been really, really memorable. Traveling into Caribbean once a year. Pretty neat. I'm glad you had that experience, and of course, when you went into the scene of fashion, I think you got called on it. As far as Trey talked about skydiving, owning a sailboat, loving Astros, and flying a plane at the age of 12, which I thought was pretty cool. And if I had my vote, I would have said sailboat, and I think that everybody pretty much caught on that. So Trey, not a very good liar, not really good at deception. Don't know if you could do very well with covert operations, but it was kind of fun looking at what you guys put out there. And then Justin have little experience with Intel. That was really interesting. Being a Texan, exercising, and working at the wall. Oh, having a friend who was a warden at the Walls unit. And I think everybody sort of zoomed in on your really, really good background in intelligence, and the fact that calling it a little intelligence was probably your lie. So overall, just a very ethical group of people. Nobody truly in your group was just this really devious person that came out with a stuff that you would have never thought. But I enjoyed the semester with you. I do know that I still owe you the ethics hangout, which gets stuck in the pipeline. You will have it before the semester is over. You grouped it very well in your discussions. You follow the cue from one another. You organize them well. You led them well. Justin, Trey, and Nahrya. So I really enjoyed the exploration of topics you had throughout the semester. So cheers, good luck with your finals. I'm looking forward to reading them. The risk communications during the Ebola crisis, not every during the Ebola crisis, not every Brexit that was proposed out of Texas, and it had a lot of traction and a lot of support and a lot of advocacy in the Brexit that was
interaction and a lot of support and a lot of advocacy. Is out of operations in that region on that particular rig. In that particular area, they are losing millions. Hello and welcome to my comments on the Google Hangout for my group by Justin, Nahrya, and Valeria and Trey. With Justin facilitating, I just wanted to let you know that you had a really good group discussion. I particularly enjoyed the fact that you didn't skip the risk communications during the Ebola crisis. Not every group covered that topic, so I was really glad to see you engaged in that. And you started with it. So you started with question number